Serious. People of Reddit that believe in the paranormal, ghosts, demons, angels, etc. What exactly happened to make you start believing? I'm still not sure if I believe. My wife says she saw a ghost years ago in her home country and does believe, but here's a story we were both involved in. We were walking down a road once and I happened to look up in a house. There was a silhouette of a woman just standing there. I pointed it out to my wife. This woman seemed to be staring right at us, and it was creepy as heck. We were walking a good 100 feet from the house. When we came back later that night, she was still in the window. When I pointed this out, my wife freaked, literally crumpled to the floor sobbing. Every time we'd walk past that house at night, we'd see this silhouette, never changing position, but seemingly turning to face us. This continued for a while before my wife did something very fleabing stupid, and I did something yellow-bellied. She went and knocked on the door during daylight. I noped the flurbo out and stood there watching from like 100 meters away. I watched as she entered the house after a discussion, and I watched as she came sprinting out of it 20 seconds later screaming. The door behind her just closed, nobody even poked their head out to look. Apparently, an older woman had answered the door, laughed when my wife explained and said there was a large painting in the room that might have looked like a silhouette. My wife was invited to look at the painting. According to her, there was no painting. That silhouette still haunts us to this day, we tend to avoid it. I must have been between 6 to 8 years old. I can't really remember. I probably blocked it out. I lived in an older duplex with my mom, my brother, and his girlfriend. One night, I woke up to this loud clicking noise coming from the living room. For some reason, I thought that I should go investigate by myself in the middle of the night. I do just that. So as I'm making my way closer to the living room, I realize the clicking noise I'm hearing is coming from the keyboard on the computer. Once I get to the living room, I try to see if anything is making the noise. It's not pitch black, there is some light coming in from the street. Because I can tell the noise is coming from the computer keyboard, I focus on that, and all I see is this black mass. It's the darkest thing in the whole room. I get this overwhelming feeling that whatever this is wants to hurt me, and suddenly the typing stops. My fight or flight response kicked in and ran as fast as I could to my mom's bed, and I got as close to her as I could, and I didn't have a single part hanging out of the blanket. To this day, it's the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. My childhood home is haunted. Where my house is, there used to be another house. It burned down, and the father of the family who lived there died in the basement during the fire. The family sold the land, and the house was cleared away and a new house built over the old basement. My grandmother, who lives in the same town, knows the family. Anyways, my parents bought the new house when I was a toddler, and we've lived there for 20 years. The ghost of the guy who died in the fire, named Charlie, lives in our house, and it's pretty obvious. My mom says that once, when she and my dad were arguing, she took to the bedroom to cool off. She said, "Charlie, I wish you could knock some sense into him." Not 5 minutes later, my dad starts swearing from the living room. The shelves above his chair had fallen and knocked him in the head. They've never fallen before or since. Any animal we have, a couple dogs when I was a kid, my cat now, will stare down the hallway for long stretches of time, then go bananas chasing something from the living room at one end to the bedrooms at the other, like they're playing with someone. I personally have heard footsteps. Big, heavy footsteps, like someone wearing work boots walk up and down the hallway, especially at night. It scared me as a kid, but now I just take it as Charlie checking on our safety. My grandmother, while visiting us one time, woke up in the guest bedroom to a shadow man standing in the doorway. She hid under the blanket for a few minutes, then decided it was safe. When she came out of the blanket, the shadow man was at her bedside, leaning over her. She hid under the blanket again until she fell asleep. The most concrete evidence for me was the time Charlie scared something off. My bedroom was always the coldest room in the house, and often I felt uncomfortable in there, like I was sitting next to someone who disliked me. One day, I went to grab clothes for a shower and walked right into a wall of evil halfway down the hall. I can't describe it fully, nothing looked different, I just felt like I had physically crossed a barrier into a force field of hatred. I knew without a doubt in my body that I was in danger, and without thinking, I hauled butt to the opposite end of the house, to the kitchen. I stood at the stove, shaking. I was about 14, afraid to look down the hallway in case I saw whatever was down there, but afraid that if I didn't look, it would sneak up on me. I eventually convinced myself that I was being a baby and started walking slowly through the dining room and towards the hall, afraid the entire time. All at once, I felt a strong breeze blow by my left side, going down the hall towards my room, like how it feels when someone runs by you and barely avoids running into you. And I thought for a second that I heard a man's voice. I continued down the hall, and I couldn't feel the evil anymore. I went into my room, and it felt lighter and more comfortable than it ever had in my life. I thanked Charlie, and from then on, I've never felt that uncomfortable feeling in my room. I think he protects it now. But yeah, growing up in a haunted house is pretty convincing, IMO. Sophomore year of college, one of my roommates came home absolutely wasted from a party and proceeded to fall asleep on the floor of the living room. Naturally, the rest of us took that opportunity to stack as many things possible on top of him. We took the top off a board game to give ourselves an even surface to stack things on his chest. It wasn't until the next day we realized we took the top off a Ouija board and used that for our surface. Weird stuff started happening around the house after that. The following evening, we had some friends over to watch The Conjuring. During the movie, the TV turned itself off the moment before the spirit or whatever would pop out. Okay, TV was acting up, so we would turn it back on and rewind so we didn't miss anything. Except the TV would turn itself off again at the exact same moment it did before. We would turn it back on, skip a little bit, and without fail, the TV would turn itself off again the next time the spirit was going to pop out. The remote for the TV didn't work, so I know this wasn't a prank someone was pulling either. This happened 13 times during the movie. At first we thought it was just a wild coincidence and stayed because we thought it added to the scary movie. After the first few times, people in the room started to get spooked. Around the 7th time it happened, we realized this wasn't a coincidence. On the 13th time, every single person in the room noped the flurbo out of there. My roommates and I all slept somewhere else that night. The next day, we called the landlord and all got out of the lease we were supposed to sign for the following year. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, the house that my family and I rented was haunted. My cousins and I were really into the show Ghost Hunters at the time, and we're all about the same age. One night, it was just the four of us. My sister was at a friend's house and my parents were out at dinner. My room was in the basement and we were playing video games down there. We had heard a slight thump from upstairs, and being the brave ghost hunters that we were, we decided to investigate. When we got upstairs, we found that no one was home and that my mom's ceramic waterfall was running. We didn't think anything of it until one of my cousins pointed out that it was unplugged. The rest of us just laughed, but sure enough, the darn thing was unplugged. We ran downstairs as fast as we could, slammed my door shut, and all hid under the same blanket for the rest of the night. Now that I'm 22, I still don't know how that waterfall was running. On another occasion, my mom was taking a nap in her bed and felt a small child climb onto the bed with her. Assuming it was my sister, she turned over to see no one there and an indent, as if a child were lying there. Our dog at the time would also go up to my parents' closet and just stare up as if someone was standing in there. My aunt also lived with us for a while, and when she would be alone in the house, she would hear a voice that sounded like my mom, her sister, calling out to her. One time, her stereo system turned itself up to full volume out of nowhere, and she ran out of the house crying. For one reason or another, we moved out of the house, but I wish we hadn't. Whatever was there didn't seem to want to harm anybody. Since I was really young, I had horrible night anxiety. I refused to sleep alone or would stay up all night out of fear throughout most of my early childhood. I would scream at the slightest noise at night or cry for help if I saw a particularly scary shadow. That's why this memory has always been so odd and stuck with me for years. I was around 5 or 6 years old in my aunt's old house. I was sharing a bed with my mom and sister, with me on the far right of the bed. Beside the bed was a hat rack, and I remember waking up suddenly, staring intently at the rack. There was the tall outline of a man with long hair standing there in front of the rack, but he was completely black like a shadow. I remember staring at the shadow, then turning around to my sister and mom, seeing that they were asleep. I had no fear or feeling to wake them up, which is so unusual for me. I just remember feeling like I shouldn't wake them up and I wasn't scared, which again, I can't stress enough how so unlike young me that was. I kept staring at him and he opened his eyes, mind you, he was completely shadowy black except for eyes, and I can't remember at all if they had color or looked like regular eyes or whatever, but I knew they were his eyes, and it was almost like he only had his eyes closed because he was aware he looked like a shadow and thought I wouldn't be able to see him in the dark room if he closed his eyes. But once he opened his eyes, he knew I saw him and began to laugh this really high-pitched laugh. He then, I don't know how to describe it, but kind of jumping jacked away from around the side of the bed to middle of the room, where the bathroom door was ajar, and jumped into the bathroom, with a jingling noise ringing the whole time. I remember still not wanting to wake my family up and remember staring at the door with no particular emotion, then going back to sleep. The next morning when my mom woke me up to get ready, I told her not to go in the bathroom because a stranger was in there. She got mad at me and brushed me off because she thought I just didn't want to brush my teeth or I had another nightmare or something. This kind of stuff has happened a lot to me, usually in more minor instances thankfully, and my mom eventually began to believe and be more receptive to it, and years later when I was about 15 or so, we were going over a lot of the experiences I had, much more minor ones, and then I asked her if she remembered when I told her about the stranger in my aunt's bathroom. She was shocked that I still remembered telling her that I hadn't spoken of it since it happened and that I had described my experience the same way I did to her when it happened years and years ago. She later called my aunt to talk about it, and my aunt talked about how her high school friend who was a male always had long hair and wore a chain on his jeans. This was the late 70s and he passed away when he was 16, and she wondered if who I saw was him. Which would explain the long hair, jingling, high voice, why I didn't freak out like I usually did. I like to think it was him. Or even maybe it was a dream, because something about the shadowiness and how I felt, even though I wasn't exactly scared, still makes me uneasy.